Coda, the establishment of silence. This chapter is about a single mechanism operating at multiple scales, how concentrated power uses silence, diplomatic, editorial, institutional, to avoid accountability. We have seen this mechanism throughout this book. In tax codes shaped by those who benefit from them, in public services withdrawn without explanation, in charitable structures that serve wealth while claiming to serve the public good. The mechanism is always the same. No single actor designs the outcome, but the direction of the pressure is consistent, and consistent pressure over decades produces the same result as design. This chapter traces that same mechanism outward, to the international order, to the courts that powerful states help build and then ignore, to the media conglomerates that consolidate editorial control while performing the gestures of independence. The examples are different. The pattern is not. When Prime Minister Carney stood at Davos and invoked Thucydides, the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. He was describing a world in which powerful states increasingly ignore the rules they themselves helped write. He was right to name it, but the same logic that operates between states operates within them, through institutions that go quiet when the truth is inconvenient for the powerful. Silence, it turns out, is not neutral. It is a form of complicity. And it operates the same way whether the subject is an international arrest warrant, a corporate tax avoidance structure, or the editorial priorities of a newspaper owned by private equity. When the strong ignore the rules, they wrote the post-war international order was built on a premise that certain rules on sovereignty, on the conduct of war, on the protection of civilians, would apply to all nations, including powerful ones. International courts were established, treaties were signed, institutions were built. That premise is now visibly fraying. In 2023, the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Russian President Vladimir Putin, citing the unlawful deportation of Ukrainian children. Putin has continued to travel internationally, attend summits, and receive heads of state, with ICC member states declining to arrest him. That is a troubling gap between rule and enforcement. But in January 2026, the same mechanism revealed itself in a starker and more unambiguous form. On January 3, 2026, the United States military launched Operation Absolute Resolve, airstrikes on Venezuelan military infrastructure in and around Caracas, followed by a special forces raid that forcibly removed incumbent Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro from his country at gunpoint. Maduro and his wife were flown to New York and arraigned in Manhattan federal court 2 days later. The Trump administration described the operation as a law enforcement action. Legal scholars from Cambridge, Stanford, Yale, and Chatham House described it as something else. A clear violation of Article 2.4 of the United Nations Charter, which prohibits the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. The UN Secretary General said the operation constituted a dangerous precedent. The non-aligned movement, representing 125 nations, condemned it at an Emergency Security Council session. Professors of international law on multiple continents used a single word to describe it: illegal. The U.S. government's defense rested on two arguments. First, that Maduro was an illegitimate leader, his 2024 election widely regarded as fraudulent. Second, that Venezuela had enabled narco-terrorism threatening American security. Neither argument, legal experts noted, provides justification under the UN Charter for a unilateral military operation against a sovereign state. What made the episode particularly instructive? For a book about how power shapes the rules it then operates under, was what happened next. Trump announced the United States would run the country of Venezuela until a judicious transition could be arranged. Within weeks, a $300 million oil deal was struck with Venezuela's remaining government. Venezuelan law was amended to give private companies control over oil production. U.S. sanctions on Venezuelan oil trade were lifted. The stated rationale was justice. The documented result was oil, power, and accountability. This is Thucydidean logic made visible. The strong, nations with military alliances, economic leverage, and Security Council vetoes, do what they can. Ignore inconvenient rulings, shield their allies from accountability, and reframe legal obligations as political inconveniences. The weak, smaller nations, stateless peoples, those without nuclear arsenals or reserve currencies, suffer what they must. They are subject to the full force of international law when it suits the powerful, and abandoned by it when it does not. Prime Minister Carney warned against the return of power politics. But power politics never left. It simply became more visible. The structure of selective justice. What makes this pattern so important, and so directly relevant to everything this book has argued, is the mechanism. It is not that powerful actors simply break the rules. It is that they bend the institutions meant to enforce those rules. They apply pressure, they withhold funding, they question legitimacy, they change the subject. This is guided drift applied to international law. Active pressure, diplomatic, financial, political, produces a passive-looking result. Accountability that applies to the weak and evaporates for the strong. Sound familiar? It should. We have seen this same mechanism in Canadian tax policy, in the retreat of public services, in the structure of charitable foundations. The rules exist. The enforcement is selective. The selection favors those with power. And when ordinary citizens ask why a military superpower can remove a foreign head of state by force and face no legal consequence, while a person who missed a tax filing faces the full machinery of the state, the answer is the same answer this book has given throughout. It is not an accident. It is a structure. The powerful have shaped the rules so that the rules bend around them. What comes next, and why it matters here? In the days after Venezuela, Trump invoked what he called the Don Roe Doctrine. American dominance in the Western Hemisphere would never be questioned again. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said of Cuba, "If I lived in Havana and I was in the government, I'd be concerned." Asked directly about military action in Colombia, Trump's answer was, "Sounds good to me." On Greenland, a sovereign Danish territory and NATO ally, Trump said he would not rule out military force to acquire it. He used Venezuela as the proof of concept, and Canada. Trump had spent months calling Canada the 51st state, threatening economic coercion to force a merger, and signing an executive order asserting U.S. strategic interest in Arctic waterways. Waterways Canada considers its own. Former UN ambassador and Ontario Premier Bob Rae said it plainly. The American government doesn't take Canada's sovereignty seriously. It would be a mistake for Canadians to think they are not on the menu too. This is not paranoia. This is the pattern made plain. A world in which the strongest power removes heads of state by military force, sanctions the judges who might hold it accountable, and openly signals that the same logic applies to its neighbors, is a world in which the rules no longer protect anyone who cannot protect themselves. It is a world where the social contract between states, like the social contract within them, has been quietly hollowed out, not through a single dramatic rupture, but through the accumulated weight of choices that were each individually allowed to pass without consequence. The mechanism is the same whether the subject is a Canadian tax code or a Venezuelan capital. Consistent pressure applied by those with the power to apply it in one consistent direction, not conspiracy, not accident, guided drift. The complicity of silence. What enables this structure is not simply the power of those at the top. It is the silence of the institutions that surround them. Governments issue statements of deep concern. International bodies convene meetings. Leaders call for dialogue and restraint. The language is always careful to avoid naming who is responsible, who is accountable, and what consequence will follow. Deeply concerning is not accountability. Complex situation is not analysis. Both sides is not truth. Institutional silence, the careful, calibrated, lawyer-approved silence of governments and international bodies, is not neutrality. It is a position. It tells the powerful, you are safe. It tells the vulnerable, you are on your own. And the habit of silence, once cultivated, travels. Institutions that learn to stay quiet about one inconvenient truth find it easier to stay quiet about the next. The posture becomes the culture. The culture becomes the norm. The consolidation of the free press. If governments are one pillar of accountability, journalism is the other. A free press is not a luxury. It is the mechanism by which citizens learn what power is doing. Without it, guided drift becomes invisible drift. And in North America, that pillar is cracking, not from censorship, but from consolidation. In Canada, the picture is stark. Bell, Rogers, Postmedia, Chorus, and Kobo control the overwhelming majority of television, radio, and print media in the country. 4 vertically integrated conglomerates, Bell, Rogers, Shaw, now Chorus, and Quebecor, account for roughly 55% of the entire Canadian media economy. Postmedia, which controls more than 100 newspapers and news sites, including the National Post and major dailies in every major city, is 66% owned by a U.S. private equity firm. In 2011, every Canadian newspaper except the Toronto Star that editorially endorsed a prime ministerial candidate endorsed Stephen Harper, representing roughly 95% of editorial opinion, despite Harper polling at barely a third of the electorate. In 2015, 17 daily newspapers representing 71% of expressed editorial opinion endorsed the Conservative Party. The owners of the Postmedia Group directed all 16 papers in their national chain to do so. In the United States, the pattern is the same at scale. In 2024, just 10 companies controlled a quarter of all U.S. newspapers, with 3 of the largest owned by private equity firms whose primary interest is not journalism, but return on investment. 7 corporations, including Fox, Disney, Comcast, and Warner Bros. Discovery, control the majority of what Americans see on broadcast and cable television. As media analyst A.J. Liebling observed decades ago, freedom of the press is guaranteed only to those who own one. The result is not propaganda in the blunt Soviet sense. It is something more subtle and more durable. The narrowing of what questions get asked, which stories get resources, which perspectives get platforms, and which truths get treated as truths. The myth of false balance. Into this narrowed landscape comes one of the most corrosive ideas in modern journalism: the requirement for balance. The premise sounds reasonable. Present both sides. Give equal time. Let the audience decide. It sounds fair. It sounds like journalism. But here is what it actually produces. When a climate scientist explains that the planet is warming due to human activity, a position supported by overwhelming scientific consensus, balance requires finding someone to dispute it. When economists demonstrate that certain tax structures entrench inequality, balance requires a spokesperson to argue the opposite. When historical record shows that a particular policy caused demonstrable harm, balance requires someone to defend it. This is not fairness. This is the manufacture of false equivalence. It treats established fact as one opinion among many, and in doing so, serves those whose interest lies in confusion rather than clarity. Truth is not a hypothesis. It is not a side. The earth is not flat because some people believe it is. A tax policy does not become equitable because its architects say so. A war crime does not become a matter of perspective because the perpetrator has powerful allies. And the requirement for balance, applied selectively, conveniently, inconsistently, functions as a tool for those who benefit from uncertainty. It is not coincidental that the loudest demands for equal time and hearing both sides tend to appear precisely when the evidence is clearest and the implications most uncomfortable for the powerful. Real journalism does not give equal weight to truth and its denial. It investigates, verifies, and reports. It names things accurately. It distinguishes between what is contested and what is established. And crucially, it does this without asking first whether the answer will upset the people who sign the checks. Ownership shapes what you see. The myth of balance becomes even more troubling when placed against the reality of consolidated media ownership. Because balance is not applied neutrally, it is applied selectively, and the selection reflects the interests of owners. When Bell Media's vice president meddled directly in CTV's news coverage during a CRTC review that affected Bell's business interests, it was not an isolated incident. It was a documented example of what concentrated ownership makes structurally possible. When Post Media directed its 16 papers to endorse the same candidate, it was not a coincidence. It was editorial policy set by ownership. The question of who owns a media outlet is never just a business question. It is a political question. It is a question about whose version of events reaches the public, whose interests are treated as common sense, and whose grievances are treated as fringe concerns. In a system where 5 conglomerates shape the information environment of 38 million Canadians, the range of permissible thought narrows. Not through censorship, but through the far more powerful mechanism of emphasis, framing, and omission. Stories that challenge the business model of the parent company do not get killed dramatically. They simply get less space, less follow-up, less prominence. The drift is guided. The result is passive-looking. The direction of the pressure is real. Silence as a habit, and its consequences. This is why the establishment of silence matters. Not just in international law, not just in media coverage, but in every domain this book has examined. Institutions that develop the habit of staying quiet about powerful people breaking rules find that habit transferable. The same posture that says nothing about a world leader ignoring an international warrant says nothing about a corporation evading taxes. The same editorial culture that manufactures balance around inconvenient facts manufactures balance around inconvenient policies. And the people who pay the price are always the same people. Those without the leverage to make their silence matter. Those whose suffering does not disrupt any comfortable arrangement. Those who were never consulted when the rules were written and are never protected when the rules bend. This book has argued throughout that consistent pressure, applied over decades in one direction, is the mechanism by which power entrenches itself. The establishment of silence is guided drift applied to truth. It is the careful, sustained management of what can be said, what must be balanced, what gets investigated, and what gets forgotten. What we owe each other instead. The antidote is not nostalgia for some golden age of objective journalism that never quite existed. It is the insistence, stubborn, unglamorous, ordinary, that truth is distinguishable from its denial, that accountability applies or it doesn't, and that the test of any institution is whether it holds the powerful to the same standard as the powerless. If international courts issue warrants, those warrants must be enforced, or the entire architecture of international accountability is exposed as a system that serves the weak and protects the strong. If journalism claims to serve the public, it must do so regardless of whether the truth inconveniences those who sign its operating budgets. If governments claim to uphold democratic values, they must apply those values to the structures of power within their own borders, not just in speeches about the international order. Truth is not a hypothetical theory. It is not a perspective. It is not one side of a debate that requires artificial equivalence to be fair. It is what happened, what is happening, and what the evidence shows. The establishment of silence depends on our willingness to accept managed ambiguity where clarity is available. It depends on our exhaustion, our distraction, and our quiet accommodation to a narrowing of what can be said. That accommodation is a choice, and it can be unmade. When institutions go silent, ordinary people must fill the void with honesty. When journalism narrows, citizens must widen it by sharing what they know, naming what they see, and refusing the false comfort of both sides when one side is simply wrong. The establishment has had its say. The pressure has run in one direction long enough. Now it's our turn.